Mitinda, everybody. I've only just passed my grade 1 exam, so this presentation will be in English, I'm afraid. So thank you for the introduction, Kenza. As you know by now, my name is Debbie, and in my presentation today, I'm going to be outlining the development of some postdoctoral research that I intend to do here at the Institute of Cornish Studies. The preliminary title is The Role of Language Ideologies in Shaping Cornish Language Education. So I'll start by explaining what I mean by language ideologies, and then I'm going to give you some examples of the language ideologies around the Cornish language that you can find in our high circulating newspapers. After, I'll report some studies that are somewhat related to my topic around attitudes to the Cornish language, and then finally I will outline the research proposal that I intend to do here at the Institute of Cornish Studies. Okay. So, put simply, language ideologies are representations of or discourses about the structure and use of language. So, for example, structure can be grammatical structures, vocabulary choices, or other features of language that, for example, differentiate the standard language from a regional variety, or the vernacular. It also concerns use, and by that I mean opportunities to use a language. So, for example, in law, in higher education, in business, and certainly global business, very few languages relatively are used. So it's similar to attitudes and perceptions, but language ideologies are related to the social, political, and economic position of different languages, with consequences for the vitality of a language and then perceptions of the people that speak them. They are often promulgated through language policies at many different levels, for example, national or governmental, supranational, such as the World Health Organization or the UN, institutional, such as a university, and along with the theme of the conference today, educational language policies and even family language policies. So I explored my interest in language ideologies and language policies after and during spending 2 decades in international education through a single language, which has implications for inclusion, for efficiency of teaching and learning, and that's not to mention any social justice related issues such as domain-specific subtractive bilingualism, where one language will lose out to another in certain areas, such as higher education. Also, during my doctoral studies, I had the opportunity to take a module in Indigenous studies, and I was surprised by the dearth of research into language ideologies in the Cornish language, particularly as they prevail in the media here, and the media being the hidden power, or the fourth estate, if you like. So I'm going to show you some examples from our highest circulating newspapers to exemplify what I mean, and I think you will probably agree with me that these examples I show you frame Cornish as irrelevant or invalid, or at least very negatively. So these are some examples from the Mail Online, and parts that are in red are the parts where I think that the language is framed as invalid or irrelevant. So in this case, traditional Manx and Cornish are now extinct, and Irish Gaelic is at risk of going the same way, according to a study of endangered languages published in 2009. Moves to make Cornwall officially bilingual have sparked a furious row after it was revealed that just 300 people speak the language fluently. Nick Clegg yesterday handed over £150,000 of public money to promote a language barely anybody speaks. Having lobbied ministers to save the endangered Patagonian toothfish as a high priority, Prince Charles is embarking on an even more quixotic quest, which is the naming of the roads and streets in Cornish in the new town near Newquay. Cornish, one of the least spoken languages in the world, but despite this, Cornwall Council has voted to back plans to revive it at a cost of 180,000. I'm sure I don't need to point out that, with all the money flying around at the moment, these are very, very paltry sums. And finally, now Euro-Mandarins tell the English to stop oppressing Cornish minorities, help revive their little used language. So as you can see, the Mail's message basically is not in favour of the Cornish language, not encouraging of the Cornish language at all. We can see somewhat similar examples from the Sun, maybe unsurprisingly. So here, the Corn identity, government officials spent more on Cornish language lessons than on English ones for struggling Brits, reveals the Darling report, with the byline, poor English as a major cause of segregation, which is now at worrying levels, claims a landmark report. I'm unclear whether this is a comment on the failures of English or language teaching of Cornish, but anyway, it doesn't put Cornish in a very good light. Slightly more upbeat, I suppose, is the Cornish High Note, record number 6, Cornish language exams thanks to Gwenno Saunders' album, and the byline there, exam secretary Tony Hack says a 15% rise in people sitting the exam is partly down to Saunders, which personally I find somewhat condescending, that this groundswell of interest in Cornish language is down to a pop singer. It doesn't do any harm, does it? But yeah. Okay, so I'm interested in how do these ideologies feed into attitudes towards the Cornish language, and then how does that filter down into educational contexts? So one survey that somewhat touched on this, and I get the feeling that maybe some people in this room participated, it was a language proficiency and attitude survey by Jean Ferdinand, I think it is, in 2019. She had 367 respondents, and she divided these into 3 groups. So the first group were Cornish speakers, 220 of them, and they were people that could speak a few words to people who were fluent in Cornish. The second group were people who identify as Cornish but do not speak the language, and the third group were the people who do not identify themselves as Cornish and they do not speak the language. Interestingly, some of them did have Cornish heritage, but I think that was rather few. So the survey entailed responding to statements using a 5-point Likert scale, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with. It goes from strongly disagree to disagree, neutral, agree to strongly agree. And I just wanted to point out some highlights as they are related to the research I'd like to do. So first, the survey wished to sort of tap into attitudes by giving these statements, which had to be put on this Likert scale, this 5-point Likert scale. So Cornish is interesting, and Cornish is not a low-class language. What she meant by low-class language was low prestige. And you can see that even in group 3, where these were the people that didn't identify as Cornish and didn't speak the language either, even there, the percentages are quite high, over half and 3/4. But how did that translate into action? Well, one of the statements was about Cornish being made official, and by that they meant the language being promoted by the Cornish Council and bilingual street signage, that kind of thing. And you can see even, the percentage is still quite high, and even half and half in those people that are those do not speak Cornish and do not identify as Cornish. And then let's compare that with education. So Cornish should be introduced in education. We can see that the agreement there is waning, and Cornish should be made a compulsory subject in education, where we can see that the percentages are even lower there. For me, that's not surprising. The other context I'm familiar with is the Finnish context, and there's a lot of consternation over the compulsory teaching of Swedish, for example. But I'm interested in these relatively high percentages contrasted with relatively low percentages when it comes to education. Another study that I just want to share something from. This was a doctoral thesis by Catherine Camps, and Shall the Trelawney Die Not in My Classroom. So this this doctoral research was not about the Cornish language, but it was about Cornish teacher identity. And she was highlighting the struggles that further education and higher education teachers have with making their Cornish identity valid and relevant in educational contexts. At the beginning of her research, she reports some moments in her own and her children's lives, the things that compelled her to do this research in the first place. And I just want to share one of those with you. So this is the context of a French lesson where they're undertaking an activity. The students were asked to annotate a map of Europe in French, and one of the students had used the word Cornouailles, and the teacher had asked him to replace that with Angleterre. So for me, and probably for many of you, this is a missed teaching opportunity, which could have gone further. But for this teacher, she either chose to suppress the Cornish language or Cornish identity, or was unaware of the history of Cornwall. I think from the study I got the feeling that this teacher did not have a Cornish identity herself. But either way, it had an impact on the child's education. And in her research generally, she suggests there's a downplaying of Cornish identity in educational contexts, depending on the situation and the interlocutor. So it's this research from Camps and also from Ferdinand, and my own interest in language ideologies, language policy and education that's motivated me to propose my postdoctoral research plan. The research I would like to do will be in, let's call it 3 stages. So in the first stage, I'd like to analyse media and public discourses around the Cornish language, because I'm interested in what shapes people's attitudes and perceptions and the relationship between these discourses and ideologies and policy. The question marks there are really to do with, and maybe this is something people can help me with here today, is where to start this analysis from. So just to explain a bit more, I intend to use the British Newspaper Archive to do this work, to look at those media discourses. And I've suggested 1967 because I believe that's the establishment of the Cornish Language Board. Seemed like a point to start. To the present day, this will have potentially implications for research methodology, especially with the advent of social media, but I haven't quite worked that out yet. And I'm also thinking about, while it will be a discourse analysis, I'm also thinking about using techniques from corpus linguistics, depending on the number of texts and how large the database is, and whether I can do something manually or whether I need the help of a computer. So those are questions for me at the moment. The second stage would be doing field work with focus group interviews with teachers and students, maybe school board members in schools. I'm interested in how do these ideologies filter down into the educational and school environment. Again, it would be a discourse analysis, and I'd expect some kind of dialogue with the first stage of the research. And then in the final stage, the potential or desired outcome would be some kind of negotiated policy or pedagogic intervention. The policy doesn't have to be something grand. It could be, for example, acknowledging Cornish vocabulary for sports and weather and food in schools, in visual displays, for example. And the intervention can simply be identifying opportunities to incorporate Cornish into teaching in schools. I'm sure you can appreciate that that's all quite difficult to predict at this stage, since I haven't even started, but that's the kind of thing that could be an outcome. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And just to summarise, we've talked about what are language ideologies and how might they relate to the Cornish language context, and then how I would like to investigate them in the context of Cornish language education. So thank you everybody for listening, and if you have any comments or suggestions or questions, I would be very, very happy to hear them.
Present-day Cornish is a pluricentric language. In other words, it has more than one codification or standardised form. Many languages around the world are pluricentric, such as French, Spanish, Norwegian, German, Chinese, and English. Pluricentricity stems from the normal variation found in all natural languages. The only languages without variation are conlangs, constructed languages that are artificial, invented, or fictional. Present-day Cornish language variation is in part due to differing codifications being taught, or as I call them, didactolects. The current situation with present-day Cornish entails problems firstly for the learner, who needs to be able to communicate with the Cornish language community as a whole. Secondly, for the teacher, who needs to be able to teach the variation within the Cornish language community. And thirdly, for the Cornish language community itself, which currently lacks harmony. Many countries have found ways to cope with pluricentricity and language variation in their teaching. Teaching Cornish language variation is essential for three main reasons: learner needs, language community needs, and pluricentristic linguistic justice. For the purposes of teaching and learning, two main approaches to language planning are important: pluricentricity and polynomy. A pluricentric language is one that has more than one codified standards. Pluricentricity is not unusual. In fact, it is the norm for many languages today, not only major world languages such as English, Arabic, Spanish, and French, but also for Norwegian. Spanish is a pluricentric language spoken around the world in numerous countries with differing codifications. In Spain, the North Central Peninsular Spanish, based on Castilian, is the preferred dialect of the Instituto Cervantes curricular plan. Another standard found in Spain is General Spanish, and is not regionally marked in terms of its grammar or phonetics, and incorporates the most broadly used vocabulary. Outside of Spain, International or neutral Spanish is a variety used in the media and accepted by most of Spanish-speaking America. Norwegian has two official codifications: Bokmål, literally book tongue, and Nynorsk, literally New Norwegian. These two standards have acquired greater autonomy over the last 40 years and witnessed a greater non-interventionist approach to language internal planning in Norway. Or as my former colleague Andrew Lynn describes it, the triumph of the voice from below over the voice from above, of planees over planners. Present-day Cornish has several codifications in use today: Kernewek Unis, Kernewek Standard, Kernewek Beo, Kernewek Kemin, and Anferv Skrifis Savonik, the standard written form. And this latter is itself pluricentric, with its two main forms and two so-called traditional forms. The pluricentric paradigm is not only a framework for documenting different varieties, but is also a model for normative language planning. That we need standardization at all is an assumption. standardisation is accompanied by various issues and problems. For example, standardisation introduces issues of authenticity and authority into the processes of language planning. The political aspect of Cornish language planning inevitably involves power relations. The legitimacy and justifiability of these power structures becomes an issue. Codified standards can suffer from ideological blind spots or fail to clearly articulate the normative assumptions on which they themselves are founded, as a result of perceptions of the field as somehow value neutral, with each side claiming the epistemic moral high ground based on professed description of the linguistic so-called facts. The reality, however, is that language planners are engaged in what can be considered aspects of a single and normative activity, a struggle to control language by defining its nature. There is also the issue of whether the codification is accepted by the language users themselves, and whether users identify with that standard. Thus, standardization can cause individuals or groups to become alienated or excluded. Moreover, some members of the Cornish language community may be expelled. In other words, they are ignored or bypassed. And this might occur because their stance is regarded as too confrontational or extreme. Over the last few years, it has been strongly suggested that top-down methods of language planning are largely unsuccessful, and that bottom-up approaches may do better in practical terms. A bottom-up approach to language planning entails the tolerance of the priorities and views of the broader language community, instead of a top-down political will that dictates the course of language policy. This bottom-up approach to language planning transfers the emphasis on standardization to diversity, and engagement of the broad community is prioritized. Whilst a pluricentric language is one that has multiple codifications, a polynomial language is one that manages its unity without imposing one variety at the expense of others. An example of polynomy is to be found in the Corsican language, where the founding ideology of the model proposes a democratic definition of Corsican in which linguistic unity is based on social consensus rather than linguistic homogeneity. The polynomic aspect of Corsican is defined both by its internal variation, multiple centres of authenticity and authority, and by speakers' recognition of linguistic unity in diversity, a collective stance vis-à-vis linguistic variation. The Irish language has three major dialects: Munster, Connaught and Ulster. For these, there is a single, widely accepted official codification of Irish spelling and grammar, Cédín of Oifashiol. This codified standard is used by the majority of schools in Ireland. However, local dialect is also used by schools, and is also used by schools near the Irish-speaking regions. The approach to pronunciation is, on the other hand, polynomial, there being no single official standard pronunciation. Some Irish dictionaries provide only a single pronunciation, but online dictionaries provide audio files in the 3 major dialects. So, with regard to the needs of the learner, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages regards language varieties as part of the learner's socio-linguistic competence. This competence includes the skills required to tackle the social dimension of language use. Thus, there is a need to teach features representative of different varieties of Cornish, so that learners acquire a comprehensive overall view of present-day Cornish. A more polynomial approach to teaching Cornish language is thus essential in order to meet the needs of the learner. Firstly, the learner needs to be able to communicate and interact with the entire Cornish language community. Secondly, a polynomial approach teaches the learner that all varieties of present-day Cornish are of equal value, form part of the richness of the expression of the Cornish language today, and should be respected. In their article on the teaching of Spanish in the UK, Barcañi and Fuertes Gutierrez report that Spanish teachers see a need to teach varieties that expand students' knowledge about Spanish, and in particular about dialects, in order to make students aware of the richness of the language. Furthermore, teachers of Spanish recognise the potential of authentic materials, in contrast to what appears in textbooks. In order to expand the learner's lexical repertoire and to teach the value of other extrinsic characteristics of Spanish, such as the homogeneity within its diversity, the Spanish teachers in the survey consider the teaching of varieties as important in order to increase learners' metalinguistic awareness and to develop metacognitive and effective learning strategies. Teachers of Cornish might perhaps learn something from their Spanish teaching colleagues in the UK. If the recommendations of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages are accepted, there are also implications for testing. It is not sufficient to test Cornish language proficiency in only one codification. Rather, the learner's socio-linguistic competence in relation to Cornish language variety needs to be tested. Ultimately, what is at stake is linguistic justice. Ignoring or rejecting some varieties of Cornish is socially unjust, shows disrespect, and is basically unethical. Furthermore, it creates division. Linguistic justice thus demands that we teach variety in order to foster mutual respect. It is vital that our learners both receive linguistic justice and learn to respect linguistic justice in the Cornish language community. In her article, The Orthography of Revived Cornish as an Attempt at Pluricentricity, published in the journal Language Problems and Language Planning, Merrin Davies-Deacon in 2020 is highly critical of the implementation of the standard written form. she writes, "The orthography of revived Cornish is an attempt at pluricentricity. The pluricentricity of the standard Cornish orthography was implemented as an attempt to resolve conflicting ideologies among different groups of users, but was unsuccessful." And she continues, "First, the pluricentricity of the standard written form can be considered a failure. While it attempted to resolve the paradox engendered by the presence of multiple conflicting ideologies by instating middle and late variants that were intended to be of equal status, this has not been reflected in practice. Late variants tend, in fact, to be marginalised and contradicting the standard written form specification, to be portrayed as subsidiary to middle variants. The bodies in charge of implementing these official uses of Cornish, the Cornish Language Office, the Academy Kernewek, and Golden Tree, do not use late variants. Furthermore, concerning Steve Harris, a learner's Cornish dictionary, she writes, "By using the middle standard written form consistently, but equating this with a lack of spelling variants, the dictionary thus implies that middle standard written form is not a variant, but instead the principal standard form of the orthography. Conversely, the absence of the late standard written form relegates that variety to the status of a subsidiary variant, implying that it is less standard than the middle standard written form. In fact, the dictionary makes no mention of the fact that the forms it uses are based on Middle Cornish, thereby equating middle standard written form with the standard written form as a whole. The middle standard written form is therefore positioned as a de facto standard orthography and misrepresenting the standard pluricentricity." And about the online standard written form dictionary, she writes, "The online standard written form dictionary is the most comprehensive freely available source for the standard written form, providing both middle and late variants. However, it also contains gaps and inconsistencies that would undoubtedly make it confusing for users between the two forms. The standard written form, then, is not used by all members of present-day Cornish language community and has thus failed to bring the Cornish language community together. In conclusion, the needs of the Cornish language learner are paramount. If a teacher teaches only one codification of Cornish, that teacher is not delivering what the student needs and is engendering division within the Cornish language community. The Cornish language community is not yet ready for a single written form. Respecting all varieties of Cornish brings the Cornish language community together. Teaching Cornish language variation is therefore essential in order to meet the needs of the Cornish language community. More equitable solutions have been found for the teaching of other languages. Same or similar can be done for present-day Cornish. To mix metaphors, we should not ignore the elephant in the room or bury our heads in the sand. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for coming. I have to say this feels quite intimidating talking to a very specialist and knowledgeable audience, so please forgive me for any sort of mistakes that I make. So I thought I'd introduce myself, talk about why I wanted to do this research, the methods that I've used, such as they are, very initial findings, and I'll run through some of those, the themes that have come out and the potential applications, and then with some space for questions. So about me is kindly introduced. I'm a filmmaker, that's Yukon. I'm currently experimenting in the 360 sphere, so making programmes where you can kind of look around the space. Used to be BBC, strong interest in music. I also teach television here. I teach mainly first year documentary, I supervise third years and look at marketing and distribution. But I've also got quite a strong interest in pedagogy. I'm new to academia, so I've only been lecturing here about 6 or 7 years, I think. So I've done a postgrad at PGCHE, and that was really interesting. It opened up my mind to different teaching methods, and methods that I hadn't necessarily engaged in myself. So as part of that, I teamed up with one of my colleagues called Rachel Jones, who's a very experimental filmmaker. She's amazing. And we sort of made an experimental film together and looked at whether we could include more play into learning. So those are the kind of sort of backgrounds that I come from. I've always been interested in languages. This is a picture of Paris. I studied French at university and spent a year living in Paris. But despite the romance of living in the heart of the Latin Quarter and writing lyrics in French with amazing teachers, Cornish is the first language that I really fell in love with. And like many love affairs, it crept up slowly when I was least expecting it. I wasn't looking for something extra in my life. I'm incredibly busy. But somehow it's just found a way into my heart and my life. And what I found interesting talking to other learners is it didn't feel like I was alone in this experience. The question about why do we learn Cornish, Pragurator Diski Kernewek, it's asked all the time. So it's part of the second grade exam, it's part of the third grade exam. So it's something that people think about, and there are a few sort of answers that come up there, and we sort of learn it from the beginning. But it's not a new question. I was brought into learning Cornish because I made a film about Henry Jenner, and having sort of worked on script, I thought, well, I might as well move on and kind of learn some more. But it was a question he asked, why should Cornish men learn Cornish? There's no money in it, serves no practical purpose, the literature is scanty and of no great originality or value. But the question is a fair one, the answer is simple, because they're Cornishmen. And I think what was really interesting in my initial research is that's a theme that did come out. I don't necessarily agree with that statement at all. But it's interesting that the questions that sort of came back from 1904 are still around today. It's interesting when you're a teacher being a student. And the question I really wanted to look at is, has the Cornish language community created ways and methods of learning that I could apply to my own subject area? Were there any lessons that I could learn? I've been really lucky to have been taught by several of the teachers in this room, several amazing talented teachers who aren't in this room, but also helped by several members of the community who've gone way beyond the call of duty, whether that's sort of sorting out last minute exam things, because I'm doing the exam at the last minute and it's sort of 10 to midnight and it's not quite done yet. But also help with the oral practice from colleagues in this room in Brittany at the Celtic Media Festival. So I feel extremely privileged and grateful to be part of this community. What struck me, there's a phrase that I coin in filmmaking called imaginary time. When you're sort of pushing through on a passion project with film, you're often working in pretend time. And despite the fact I didn't have the time or capacity to study, what I found really fascinating is, despite being pushed by both my teachers and my fellow learners, I was never made to feel uncomfortable when I made mistakes or got things wrong. And I think that's really key. And so I wanted to know whether that was just me or whether other people found similar things. So caveats, these are very initial results. I don't know how many of you in this room have very kindly filled out the survey. If you did, it would have landed on your desk sometime between Monday and Friday morning. So we are talking really initial results. I am a learner, so please, any errors in the Cornish are mine, not as a result of my teachers. So looking at the methods that I used, and if you haven't filled it in, there'll be a QR code a bit later on. It was just a simple questionnaire done on Microsoft Forms. It was shared to students and teachers via the Go Cornish list and to personal contacts, people that I knew within the community. All the responses are being kept anonymous unless I get specific permission, and hopefully I'll be doing some more in-depth interviews one-to-one with people in imaginary time. And the link was reshared on social media via my Truro, Yetha and Waring group. The process, I got 84 responses, which I think is testimony to the strength of the community, given that people didn't get it till this week, and I'm really grateful and honoured that people filled it in. I've then gone through the themes and colour-coded it and sort of looked at sort of specific things that jumped out that were repeated. In terms of the design of the form, there was some very basic data collection and questions with yes, no answers for context. Although I was interested in the qualitative results, I wanted a bit of context to work from. So those were very basic things like the length of time people had learnt Cornish, whether they felt part of the Cornish language community, the type of events learners had taken part in, the resources they'd used, whether they'd taken an exam or whether they'd been helped by another learner. Other contexts, this is from the Cornish Class Survey 2022. Apparently there are 223 active students at the moment, 21 teachers, 35 classes, but that's just for a bit of context. In terms of the qualitative questions, it was things like, why are you learning Cornish? That very current question. What people liked about learning Cornish, why people felt part of a community, why people did or didn't take an exam, if they felt they needed further resources, if they felt there were any lessons that could be applied to other settings, and what could be done to encourage more young people to learn, and if it was different of other experiences of learning subjects. And finally, good old journalistic question, anything that people wanted to add. So, very initial findings and themes. There were some things that I didn't expect. So the responses, I had some very new learners joining in. So it varied from 2 weeks to 63 years. So I thought that was quite interesting. And interesting when it came to the community question. Early on in the survey, I think it was people who'd been involved with the community longer. So it was very much everybody felt part of the community. As it filtered down to people who were new to the community, people were making comments saying, well, I've only just joined, so I don't really know what's going on kind of thing yet. Why are you learning Cornish? And the reason for these figures here is I was sort of analysing the research as I went through. So this was 37 out of 66 respondents, literally referring to Henry Denner because I'm Cornish. Living in Cornwall was another reason, as well as the language being used as a shortcut to identity, which I thought was really interesting. And that need to belong was really key. And people talked about love of Celtic languages in general, and love of Cornwall was specifically mentioned by, or love of the language was mentioned by 5 participants at that stage. What is it you like about learning Cornish? And this is where I think it's really interesting for me. It's that sense of community, that sense of belonging, the sense of support. This bit which I've wrote to my own students, the fact that it's low stress, the way it feels joyful to speak. There was mention of joy throughout the responses, and play, which was interesting given my previous research. Also, and this did surprise me, there were several mentions of challenge as a positive thing, which wasn't something I was expecting. People were actually enjoying the challenge, the personal challenge of learning and improving at something, and again, reference to the challenge. So, yeah, I wasn't expecting that. And again, following on from that, there were sort of general themes about culture and love of language, or languages generally. In terms of feeling part of a community, this was interesting. I think what is significant when you look at this is that the respondents who didn't feel part of a community was incredibly small, and I think that's, you know, to the credit of the Cornish language community that people do feel included. And again, responding to that, what I found was really interesting is online had a real role in bringing that community together, which wasn't what I expected. The sort of drive is very much to encourage people back to face, and the fact that online was so important. So one person said, I was suddenly able to plug into the community when things went online, particularly Cornish language worship services and online lessons, but there were several references and mention to that. The other thing that I found was significant was the range of events people had taken part in. So these were just some that I sort of pulled out of my head, kind of thing. So different things, so online lessons, but you can see here the online lessons are really sort of play a big role, and then we've got sort of lots of other things like the camping weekend, the Gorsev, formal lessons, Yeth and Werin. But in addition to that, I sort of put in an extra question about other events people were involved in. And I got a massive list back. So here's a cut and paste of all the other things that people are involved in, not necessarily ones that I have been involved in personally, but I thought it was really interesting to show the range of activities which can promote the learning of the language that people were involved in. In terms of resources, there were huge masses of different resources people were using. One respondent, I quite like their response, whatever's available, and I think there's a real hunger and a need for resources, so I quite like that one. In terms of taking an exam, I was surprised how many people took an exam, but actually I'll look a bit at some of the weaknesses of what I've done. Obviously I was approaching people through teachers and through their classes, so it's inevitable that would be slightly higher than I would expect. But more than, thanks for these figures, more than 18,000 students have taken exams since 1962. Out of my respondents, it was way over half who'd done it. And the reason people were saying they took exams was they liked the challenge, they liked to look at their progress, and something I can definitely relate to, it gave people an excuse to focus. It helped them focus their attention, which is one of the benefits of doing an exam. For those people who didn't take exams, there was quite a large group who just weren't interested in taking an exam. It wasn't what they wanted to do, they weren't interested in it. There was also sort of a significant feeling of people who were worried, who didn't feel quite ready yet, who didn't feel that they were confident enough to do an exam quite yet, which I think, again, is interesting. Now, this is the slide that really interests me, because it sort of does reflect my own experience, is have you ever been helped by another learner? And I think because it is quite a small community, people are very willing to help, even for less than able students. So people within the community are prepared to give up their time to help you practice your oral on a coach in Brittany, or whatever it is. You know, you've got people stepping in to help, and I think that's really, really interesting, particularly when you take account of the number of new learners in the group. So looking at potential outcomes, because really what I was interested in is whether the way I felt about the way it was Cornish was being taught, whether there was anything I could draw out of it. And I think the importance of community is really significant. The importance of peer-to-peer learning, the importance of flexibility of learning styles and resources. I think it's to the credit of the way things are set up at the moment that you can do an exam, but you don't have to do an exam. You can take time out and you can come back to it. The importance of online learning has definitely, I'll be implementing that into my own teaching, because I kind of assumed everybody wanted to be face-to-face, but it's not always the case. And actually, if I look at my own case, there's no way I could get from teaching here to my lesson in Truro. It just wouldn't work, but because it's online, I can access it. And the importance of exams and alternatives for people who don't like them. So the themes that I'll be looking at sort of moving forward is peer-to-peer learning, but also this idea that you're taking responsibility for your own learning. And I think pedagogically that's really important. You're not doing it because you've been told you must do your homework. You're seeking out your own resources, and I think that's really responsible learning. Being part of a community. Also, when we look at things like the Cornish Language Weekend, the importance for the intensity of sprint learning sessions, the need for flexibility and the need for challenge, and again this idea of continuing online learning. Again, it came up in sort of so many of the different questions. I wouldn't have been able to have learnt Cornish had it not been online, due to where I live and due to the ongoing pandemic and living with somebody who's clinically vulnerable. So I think that's really important, that people are able to access it, perhaps if they're unwell, perhaps if they've got disabilities. Financially, it's much cheaper to learn online, and that's really useful. And people mentioned this shared sense of purpose, which I found quite uplifting reading through the answers. The other thing that came out quite clearly was the attitudes of the teachers, and this kind of idea that people now feel that they're involved in something greater than themselves. The the speed of teaching, some people like being able to go very quickly, the enthusiasm, the encouragement, and that feeling of having met new friends. Touching on responsibility as well, people come away with the idea that they want to pay things forward. I know several of my friends who've progressed far more quickly through the system than I have are keen to help, and they're keen to help hand back, and so people literally mention that phrase, pay things forwards. Somebody else said it's like holding something delicate. In a way it's yours, it feels like a close relationship. If you do Cornish, you're aware that every action that you do or don't take counts, so that's that idea that the learners can influence the learning community. Somebody else said it takes over your life once you're in the Cornish language community, there's no going back. Seriously though, you feel you have to do things to help spread the load, which I think is really interesting. Weaknesses in my study, I fully admit I have rose-tinted spectacles. I've only been learning for 5 years, I haven't got to the 7-year itch yet. And also it's a self-selecting sample, and it's also a sample of people who are able to engage online. On the other hand, going back to Henry Jenner again, he talks about that sentimentality and says that if everything sentimental were banished from it, the world would not be as pleasant a place as it is. And I think I'm not the only one in my sentiments about it. Somebody else said every language has its own way of seeing the universe and articulating human experience. It's unlike any language I've learnt before, the words are beautiful, somebody else said. So further research, what happens now? I'm planning to talk individually to the respondents who've agreed to speak to me, and also thank all the people who replied to the questionnaire so quickly. So if you did, thank you so much, I'm really grateful. And then look at how it fits in with current pedagogical theories. If you want to contribute, and if you haven't, this is a QR code, or email me, I can send you a link. There's a link down there. Yeah, and questions?
Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, I hope you're all enjoying the conference. I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person, but I have sent this recorded, narrated PowerPoint presentation for you. And I will begin by telling you that this paper, this presentation, which is called The First Year of Teaching Cornish at the University of Exeter, is designed to tell you about the initiation and delivery of the first year in history of undergraduate teaching of the Cornish language at Exeter. As you may already know, the teaching took place on the Penryn campus, and it was delivered during the academic year 2021 to 2022, so that's last year. So I'm going to report on what happened last year. So just to give you some background, the title of the module that we ran, and we will be running in the future, is Cornish for Beginners. After many years of negotiations by various Cornish language groups, Cornwall Council and the Institute of Cornish Studies, the presence of the Cornish language teaching was established. This is the first time that the study of Cornish as a credit-bearing module has taken place and available to undergraduates. It's begun on the Penryn campus, and there are plans to widen this out to the Streatham campus in Exeter, but more about that later. So this really was something of a watershed moment for the language, I think we'll all agree. The department that's running the module is, as you can see on the slide, which shows the home page, it's the Language Centre. It used to be called the Foreign Language Centre, but now this is called the Language Centre. Interesting irony there, of course, if Cornish was to be delivered from a department called the Foreign Language Centre within Cornwall. I'll leave you to work out the irony of that. And the Language Centre offers first-class learning resources, excellent teaching by suitably qualified and experienced professionals, so that language learning is both enjoyable and rewarding. As well as daytime teaching, the Language Centre also offers the evening language programme, which is online, and my colleague Kenza is heavily involved in teaching Cornish at different levels of proficiency in the evening programme. And also, for the first time, we have a programme called the Phonetics and Phonology of Present-Day Cornish, which is a really exciting development, and this is being taught by another of my colleagues, Dr. Jon Mills. So these courses are available to they're available to anyone, and they last for 10 weeks each. So this is another of the web pages from the Language Centre, and you can see there how the web page works. The Language Centre advertises the languages available for undergraduate study, and you can just see the first 4 there in that drop-down menu. There are others, and the others I'll show you in a moment, but it's quite exciting to see Cornish take its place in that list. There are 6,000 students on the Penryn campus, which, as you know, is shared with Falmouth University, and the Teaching Excellence Framework is gold for the Penryn campus. And this is the full list of languages available for undergraduate study in the Language Centre, and these are run across Penryn and Streatham campuses. It's quite an interesting list of modern languages. So the Cornish for Beginners module is a daytime credit-bearing module, and it doesn't cost anything for the student. All Language Centre undergraduate modules count for credits towards the degree, and because the credits are attached to modules in the Language Centre that are additional to those needed by the student to obtain their major degree, students need to make sure that their main discipline will allow them to combine with a language module. So this is an additional module that undergraduates are open and they're welcome to take. It's encouraged. It's seen as a very good thing to take a language. It won't count towards your degree in the sense that you still have to get your full 360 odd credits in order to achieve your main degree. Some subjects in the university don't allow the combination of a Language Centre module. For instance, law doesn't, and renewable energy doesn't either, I think. So the whole thing works on goodwill, because if you think about this financially, the department that you're taking your degree with has to be able to have less income from students. If they then take a module within the Language Centre, that's a reduction of the income for that department. You'll see that the Cornish for Beginners module is worth 30 credits, and actually from Kenza and I's own experience, they have to work really hard for that 30 credits. This is not a pushover module. It's fully rigorous, and the assessment is rigorous too, and I'll come on to that later. And if students take a further 30 credits on top of this beginner's one, they then bring that up to 60 credits, which allows them to have the wording on their degree certificate, which will read with proficiency in Cornish. So for instance, if you are a geography major and you've taken 60 credits of Cornish language, you will then on your degree title have something which reads BA Geography with proficiency in Cornish. So what's the vision of the Language Centre? Well, the idea is that most undergraduate students will have the opportunity to study a language as part of their degree. Employers like this, and it is a great way of standing out from the crowd on a CV or in a job interview. So how do we recruit students to these Language Centre modules? Well, at any time students can receive guidance. They can reach out to tutors at any time. And then the module choice, the selection of the modules that the student wants to study happens from the beginning of September. And then there is a chance to change that module choice once term has already started, term 1. So that's quite good from the point of view of recruiting to a module like Cornish for Beginners, because it allows students to suddenly realise that they can do this and perhaps change their choices accordingly. So this is the all-important question. Who did we get last year for this module? Well, we had 5 students, and of those students, one we never saw. We don't know anything about this student or what happened. And one student unfortunately had to withdraw after week 1 because he found that it was incompatible with his core subject. So we were left with 3 students, and that's plenty of students to get the show on the road. So we were pleased. Kenza and I were pleased with that. What were their characteristics? Well, obviously anonymized. If you look at the left-hand column, A, B, C, D, E, those are the students. Gender, we had 1 female student. And in terms of their age, the 3 that we actually were left with as that core group of 3, which appear in grey in these columns, those are the 3 that we taught. They were all of the classic undergraduate age. They were 18, 19-year-olds. So they'd come from A-levels. 2 of them were actually second-year university students, and 1 was a first year. We don't have any information about student A because we never got to actually meet him. But interestingly, from the demographic point of view, you can see that actually the students are coming from Cornwall. There was 1 student from Northampton, and he was a very interesting student because he had his rationale was that if he was going to be studying in Cornwall, he wanted to learn the Cornish language and understand the Cornish culture. The degrees that they were studying is obviously determined by the degrees that are available at Penryn campus, the full degrees that are available there. But as this widens out to the Streatham campus in Exeter, we should see a widening of that, which could be really interesting. And then previous knowledge of Cornish, you can see that there is actually quite a bit going on there in terms of how much of the Cornish language people are being exposed to in general. So the module itself is equivalent to the A1 in the European framework. The idea is to teach students the basic grammar. They need to be achieving a confident elementary level, everyday situations, being in a shop, greetings, talking about food, buying a train ticket, all these kinds of things. And we also want to offer an introduction to the cultural aspects, which I think for many of us was one of the most satisfying things about the module. Now, in my part of the teaching, because Kenza and I co-taught this module, so Kenza taught for 2 hours a week, I taught for 2 hours a week. So when it comes to the culture, it was quite good. We got the students to collect some of the Cornish language they're seeing all around them. And that was quite a fun part of the module, but it was very serious actually, and the students responded extremely well to being guided as to how they perceive, understand and appreciate the language that surrounds them in Cornwall. The delivery of the module, well, we taught over 2 11-week terms, which amounts to 88 hours of face-to-face teaching. Quite a lot of time actually, and an enormous amount of independent study is expected of students. Whether they do that or not is anybody's guess, but I think Kenza and I took the view that students are going to be quite limited in terms of what they do outside of class because they have actually got a lot of other work to be getting on with. Our approach to the course was to make it varied and interesting, and I think we achieved that. It wasn't just rote learning or dull exercises. We brought film, we brought role play, and all sorts of interactive things into the classroom, which really brought it alive. Kenza taught the KDL course principally, and I took my cue from Bora Brav. So actually quite a nice complementary set of teaching materials. Now the assessment was a big deal in this module, and Kenza and I will both testify to the fact that this took an awful lot of our time and the students' time, because some students feel they're over-assessed, which is often the criticism levelled at the Language Centre, but their justification of that is that actually this is in line with all the other higher education providers. And it is hard learning a language. It's not something you can coast with or cram at the end of the module. You have to be constantly at it, as I'm sure everyone appreciates. But in yellow there, I've circled the essential breakdown of the assessment, which was that students provide a portfolio, which is actually 4 pieces of work inside of that portfolio, one of which is a group task. There's a written exam and an oral exam. And what makes this quite a pressurized situation is that for every item in the portfolio, 4 items in the portfolio, there are 4 formative tasks that go along with that, which means basically a practice test, which the students have to do in class. So that amounts to 8 tasks, which are assessed with feedback, and then a written exam and an oral exam. What was the student feedback like? Well, what was the student feedback like? It was good. And we were commended on the fact that all of our students replied, and that wasn't actually that difficult, was it? Because we only had 3, but that didn't bother us. We just went for the 100%. These are just some excerpts from the student feedback. What worked well? They liked the small class size, and they liked the opportunity therein for speaking practice. They liked the teaching style. Here's some more feedback. A lot of the students were very, very fixated on vocabulary, we found, although of course to us as teachers, we often find that the most satisfying and substantive part of the teaching is the grammar. Is the course content at the level? Oh, it's definitely difficult. I love that comment. That's my favourite comment of all. It's definitely difficult. And yes, 2 of the 3 students said this is at the level I expected it to be. So from the point of view of the Language Centre, they were actually pleased with the job that Kenza and I had done. There were no concerns raised that needed any investigation. The students were reasonably happy. We were happy, and therefore I think we will get invited to come back next time. So how was it for us? This is a good question. I just have to note here that I am kind of speaking for myself, and I wouldn't like to say that these are the comments that Kenza would necessarily make. Although Kenza and I have obviously talked at length about this undertaking. I loved it, absolutely loved the teaching, and it felt very special to be part of this moment where for the first time undergraduate teaching is offered. And I know that students felt equally excited about that moment. Found it really exciting to teach the Celtic grammar system as something so completely different to anything people will have been exposed to at school. And it was wonderful to link our learning to place names, house names, any signs they see around them. That was a wonderful thing to see students link into that. The political, historical and sociological aspects of teaching this was fascinating. We had very wide-ranging discussions in the class about why are we learning Cornish, where is it going, how does that fit in with my other subjects I'm learning, history, politics. There were a lot of synergies with the other programs that students were learning. And they are quite politicised and sociologically orientated students, as you expect a lot of undergraduates to be, and that gave a really interesting dimension to the experience. So those are just a few of my impressions, and also just to tell you that on the back of our class, this first class ever that we've had, we've now got a Cornish Language and Culture Society on campus. So for the first time, although it's not actually the first time, I think Gary might correct me on that, we do now have a society, and this whole initiative was driven by Peter Jenkin, who's a good friend and a great supporter of this initiative, and we had lots of conversations because his classes ended just as the Cornish language class ended on campus, and so it was great to have that dialogue with Peter. So it was Peter's idea to get this going on campus as an undergraduate himself, And then one of our undergraduates on the Cornish for Beginners module joined this initiative, and they made this happen. They got the votes, they got the support needed to launch this society. So all credit to them. And then also the Language Centre has a publication called the Language Express. And if you see on the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see what the front page looks like. And one of our students wrote an article for this called Why I Chose to Study Cornish at University. The link is on this slide, so if you'd like to read the article, you can get onto that link and read the article. I commend that to your attention. And of course, on the right-hand side of the page there is the Cornish translation. And I think, as you can see, this student likes a drop of Korev. And that was just a joy to see him in print. And that'll take him quite a long way in his further studies, I'm sure. Final comments from me. Intermediate Cornish has already been described and validated, approved by the university. Kenza wrote that. So we really have got a great future ahead here, although of course, as you see with my funny little emoji there, we don't have any students right at this moment. No students chose Cornish for this academic year, which was a disappointment. But there are plans underway to really get the marketing properly done for this course. The university is supportive, and now it is now open to all Exeter University students, because we're going to present the teaching in hybrid mode, where students in Exeter can actually join the teaching remotely, which is wonderful. So let's keep this going, is what I will say, just to finish this presentation. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions or queries, then please email me on that email address. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Now, today I'd like to talk about my PhD research with regards to authenticity. Almost, let's say, finalizing my project, my research project, my PhD research project, involving both a survey and interviews. So for my PhD, what I wanted to ask and what I wanted to answer is what are understandings of language authenticity in the Cornish language community. And today in this presentation, what I wanted to present is what are the perceptions of Cornish with regard to its ontological status as a dead or living or reconstructed language. So I will go over what authenticity is, what I mean by it, and what I mean by an ontological status with regards to the death or undeath of the Cornish language. Now, my project generally is a mixed methods approach. That is, I started off, as Andrew mentioned, with my MA, where I analyze posts from the forum, the message board you may or may not know at this point. The issue was, well, the limitation of my MA was that I think 80% of the posts that I analyzed were written by 20% of the user base. So I think about 8 people. So these people were very opinionated, with strong, informed opinions about relevant topics for the Cornish language, and they kept discussing these issues with each other on the forum for about 10 or so years. So I had a very limited access to the broader Cornish language community on that particular forum. I think I've presented this paper some years ago on Skians as well. Now, for my PhD, I wanted to go to that broader Cornish language community. So I've conducted a survey, I think 2 years ago, just before the pandemic. In the end, I have 108 survey answers. And I analyzed the survey using exploratory methods, also statistical methods, chi-square and regression analysis in particular. And I also used interviews, which I have conducted this summer, with 17 interviewees for a total of over 30 hours of recordings. And I more or less asked what I asked in my survey to basically inform my quantitative analysis with some qualitative data as well. Now, I use Coupland's framework of authenticity. So he sees authenticity, or language authenticity in particular, he divides it into 5 categories. And what I want to focus on is ontology. That is, what is the essence of something. And the issue with generally the concept of authenticity is that it's very relative. That is, the definition of authenticity is basically created on the go by the people who express judgments on desired features of something. That can be language, but to simplify it to, let's say, down to the ground example, Nike shoes, for example, you expect Nike shoes to be the exact copies of each other. You expect them to be mass produced. You expect this little sign you see on Nike shoes to be on every Nike. That is what a real Nike is, as opposed to, let's say, artisan shoes where everyone is unique. So we judge the authenticity of these 2 types of shoes by different criteria, that we expect something of them. So with regard to language, we can also expect different things. We can, for example, expect, when we discuss, for example, the Scots language, we can discuss whether it is a language or it is a dialect. That would be the ontological one aspect of ontological status of the Scots language. Some of the issues I saw in my MA research was the status of Cornish as a living or dead language. For example, that is, did it die in fact? So this is something I wanted to explore more fully in my PhD. So the survey I completed in 2020, I distributed it on the pledge. I pledged to become more fluent in Cornish webpage, Facebook group, and also sent email invitations to all language organizations, which I hope they have shared with their members. So all in all, I targeted all speakers of Cornish, like regardless of fluency or regardless to whether they belong to any organization or not. In the end, I had 108 full completions of the questionnaire. Now, I asked 18 demographic questions and also questions on language acquisition and use of the Cornish language, and that was followed by 53 Likert scale questions on opinions on certain statements, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. For the purpose of analysis, I've reduced it 5-point scale to a 3-point scale, because with the number of respondents I had, I simply needed to limit the spread of opinion in order for the results to be in any way analyzable statistically. So for ontology, I asked 18 questions. 2 of them, which I am looking at today, are 19 and 20, that is, the Cornish language died, and what is used now is a revived form of language. And the Cornish language used now is a direct continuation of what some call traditional Cornish. The slight openness to interpretation of these questions was intentional. You may ask me about it later. For now, I'm focusing on these 2 questions. And what I wanted to do with my survey basically is see whether the responses to these 2 questions in any way correlate with certain demographic information, like the length of residence in Cornwall, or membership in a Cornish language organization, or length of knowing the Cornish language, self-reported fluency, the variety of Cornish someone speaks, or whether they have taken any Cornish exams. Now, generally speaking, we can see that the opinions on the topic are not radical, that is, which surprised me at first, because as a scholar who thought, well, there was no language transmission in Cornwall at a certain point, obviously, yes, it died from my perspective as a scholar. And at the beginning, I was surprised to see the number of disagrees to that question. And also, what I surprised to see at the beginning was, well, the fact that it is considered a direct continuation of traditional Cornish. If we look at these two questions combined, what we can see is the most frequent chosen combinations of answers to these two questions was that people disagreed that the Cornish language died, and they agree that it is a continuation, which is a logical, I would say, answer or set of answers. With the second being that they both agree that it died and it is a revived language now, but also agree that it is a direct continuation of traditional Cornish. And the opposite to the first combination, that is, they agree that the Cornish language died and disagree that it is a continuation. Now, I have conducted multiple correspondence analysis to see whether this demographic information in any way predicts answers to these two questions. And the only single demographic that could do that, having done statistical analysis, is just membership in a Cornish language organization. Let me first explain what is in front of you. What this is, what the X and Y axes are, is the relative distance measured in between these points, measured in how often a given answer, how often a given respondent chooses to answer. So for example, here we saw that by a huge majority, the most frequent combination of answers to these two questions was that people disagree that Cornish died and is a revived language, but agree that it is a continuation of traditional Cornish. So if we look at this, so they disagree that it died, agree that it is a continuation, these 2 points are close to each other. That means that people tended to select these 2 answers together most frequently. At the same time, we can look at membership in Cornish language organizations. So if you are a member of a Cornish language organization, you tend to agree, yes, Cornish didn't die, it is a continuation of traditional Cornish. Now, if you're not a member of a Cornish language organization, you don't know, basically. That is, you don't have enough strong opinion on the topic. In my survey, people who were not members of any Cornish organization, tended to answer with I neither agree nor disagree, which in this case might be interpreted as I don't know or I don't care. And this is the only single demographic value that predicts something. And I conclude that thing that it predicts is that people who are not members in organizations don't have strong opinions, which is not a very radical or controversial conclusion to draw from this sort of data. Now, when I analyzed further demographic information like the length of known Cornish, fluency, exams, the variety of choice, or residency in Cornish, I could not find any statistically significant correlations. Visually, on the graphs, there seem to be tendencies, but I cannot say that. Yeah, but what I can say basically that these correlations may be random rather than there's actually something behind it. Visually, it seems that depending on how long you know Cornish, you agree that it died. You disagree that it is a continuation if you've learned Cornish for 11 to 20 years. It seems like people who have known Cornish for more than 20 years disagree that it died, but agree it is a continuation. And people who have been only learning Cornish for up to 10 have known Cornish for up to 10 years don't have opinions. And the similar kind of level of language engagement, so to say, can be seen for fluency, where people who have Cornish at the self-reported level of A, so that is A1 or A2, don't have opinions, but the more fluent you are, the more engaged with the language you are, you tend to have stronger opinions on the topic. For other demographic information, it's very unclear. I could not even see visual trends, not to mention statistically relevant trends. So I think in the end, the issue with not being able to find statistically relevant results, on one hand, it might be because the number of respondents was relatively small. On the other hand, of course, is the fact that language deaf or revived language or traditional Cornish, the terms are used in these questions, are not obvious. There may be different definitions of these terms used by the respondents of the survey. Hence, why I have also I've also decided to conduct interviews to explore these potentially conflicting definitions. So for my interviews, I did it between mid-March and June in Cornwall. I distributed the call for participants the same way I distributed my call for the survey, that is, I pledged to become more fluent in Cornish, plus emails to Cornish language organizations. And respondents had the choice to take part in 3 separate interviews, one ontology focused, 2 consensus focused, and historicity/systemic coherence focused interview. So we are interested today in the first interview on ontology. So all in all, I had 17 interviewees. 14 decided to talk on all 3 topics. And the selection of interviewees, I did not select them because in the end, 17 people signed up. 18, I didn't manage to have an interview with one person. And generally, they represent, my interviewees, a relatively varied bunch of informants. There is a bias towards fluent speakers and organization members, admittedly. The interviews were conducted both online and offline. So more or less, these were semi-structured interviews. So the question I more or less asked my interviewees was, is Cornish dead? Did it die? Or is it a revived language? And does it matter to you that the language was linguistically reconstructed. And for the first, is Cornish dead? So is it now dead? I think the answer might be very obvious to you, in that my interviewees vehemently denied that, and not a single person decided to say anything otherwise. One person said it was dormant, perhaps. One person decided to use this, to continue using this anatomical metaphor for language, and said it was on the operating table with all the buttons flashing, but it had been given an electric shock. For another person, the very concept of Cornish now being dead is inconceivable, in that the name is from the Cornish language. Another person says, well, if you little nonsensical, because someone goes, Cornish is dead, and you go, well, here I am. So there's no controversy, there's no difference of opinion with regard to whether Cornish spoken now by you is a dead language. The differences start appearing in, did it die? Is it a revived language? In that, on one hand, the perceptions of the value that my interviewees put on the collections of Cornish law and knowledge in the 18th and 19th centuries, the rhymes, the numerals, the counting, the prayers, the Cornish words in the Cornish dialect of English, they all constitute Cornish, not directly Cornish spoken naturally by a community of speakers, but Cornish nonetheless. One interviewee said there was no point in which it was gone and completely forgotten. To believe for a place that is very distinct culturally, one very sort of protective of its own tradition, but also very scattered in a way, I think would be completely naive and silly not to think, to speculate at the very least, that the transmission of the language is much greater and much more enduring than the evidence that's currently available to us. On the other hand, we have interviewees who make a distinction between it died as a community language. It died as a vernacular. It stopped being the popular language people spoke. I don't think that's a controversial opinion. Likewise, I don't think it's a controversial opinion to cling to those traces of Cornish in the 19th century and see the definition of death of a language as losing even those small bits, which Cornish never did. Now, for the last question in this aspect is, does it matter to you the language was reconstructed on Middle Cornish or Late Cornish? For this question, I was, I think, surprised by what was not said than what was said, and I'll elaborate on that in the conclusions. For now, I think there are two main aspects to the answers to this question. On one hand, well, the word reconstructed does have an artificial feel, for better or worse. Linguistically, of course, reconstructed means, well, work needed to be done to reconstruct the phonology of Cornish. It's not controversial to me, but one person answered in response to that question, when you learn the language and when you speak it, you don't have the impression it's artificial. Another that languages says that they don't mind that Cornish was reconstructed because language changes anyway. Another person said it's good that it was reconstructed because it's been a foundation for what is now. And another person asked the rhetorical question whether it is better to have a revived, reconstructed language than no language at all. A slightly different approach to this question were, I think, a similar approach to this question, to the answer to this question, was visible in, I think, 4 or 5 of my interviewees who decided to talk about, well, Middle Cornish and Late Cornish as a response to this question. So you have a majority of the speakers speaking in a particular way, that's the language. And you know, if it's similar to how it was in the 15th century or the 18th, well, what does that matter? And another person's answering directly after I have asked this question, my preference, you know, I think the most amazing books are Rod Lyon's books. And what I find interesting is that actually that so I will go to what I found not present in those quotes in a moment. For the moment, for now, what I'd like to conclude is, so there's this clear differentiation between traces of Cornish and intergenerational transmission. That is Cornish speakers will admit Cornish lost intergenerational transmission. Maybe they'll say that it died as a vernacular. They are more likely to say that it has been dormant, perhaps, that it has been sleeping, or it has been on the operating table. But there is a clear connection with death of the language and this concept of small bits and pieces of Cornish at the end of its traditional period, let's say. At the same time, present-day Cornish has its own authenticity, one speaker used the term, in that the speaker sees there needs to be a very clear line between historical Cornish and modern Cornish, and questions which are relevant for historical Cornish are not particularly relevant for the Cornish spoken now. For example, the question of whether it died or not. And I think what I was aiming to say is that the fact of linguistic reconstruction, to me, seemed like background noise. What I mean by that is that I think in those 17 people I've interviewed, I think only I've spoken with 1 or 2 about the actual process and work of reconstructing the language, linguistically, being involved in that process, and what it means in the context of speaking a language which has been passed down generation by generation as English, and speaking a language which needed the kickstarting from linguists beforehand. For the remaining 15 interviewees, that's not something that came to their minds. I'm sure all of them are aware of the history of the Cornish language and in the 20th century. But at the same time, the fact of reconstruction seems to me, by the fact it was hardly mentioned at all, even after a direct question about it, is that it's simply acknowledged as something obvious and something completely irrelevant to how people speak Cornish today. That is, the language is spoken by groups of friends, of sometimes family. But when, as a scholar, I dive into Cornish and think about who created which variety and what year and what were their reasons for doing such and such, I am interested in that as a scholar, but from the perspective of a speaker of the language, I'm sure they acknowledge the contributions of these designers, authors, linguists, members of the community. But the lack of mentioning them in the context of this question, I see as a sign of our natural ownership of the language of owning the language, of owning the language without relating it to quote unquote creators of these varieties. Whether that's good or not, that's for you to decide. But I did find the silence on the topic, the not mentioning of this topic, particularly enlightening. Statistically, like I said at the very beginning, I cannot connect any of these opinions in the survey or in the interviews to any particular demographic, with just the one conclusion that people who are new to the language don't have strong opinions on the topic. So that is all from me. Thank you very much, Miraz. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.